Great. Okay. Well, thanks again for joining this session, which is the 6th session of the Asynchronous workshop of this year's POLLEN on conservation and agrarian change. And today we're going to be talking about the political ecology of sustainable global food supply chains and what prospects and limits they have to create transformative change. So my name is Josh Lyons-White. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge. I'm joined in organising today's session by Professor Rachael Garrett, who's also here at the University of Cambridge, and also Dr. Izabela Delabre at Birkbeck, University of London. And then we have two excellent panelists joining us as well, in Dr. Pauline von Helleman from Goldsmiths, University of London, and also Dr. Christoph Oberlack from University of Bern. So I'll just give a quick overview of what the plan for today's session is. So I'll just spend the next couple of minutes introducing sustainable supply chain initiatives, and then we'll have a round of introductions from each of our panelists and also an explanation of their research, that they've presented on the website. And then we have a round of questions for our panelists, and then we want to open the floor for discussion. So please do ask questions in the Zoom chat. So why are we focused on sustainable supply chains? Well, we now live in a telecoupled world, and globalization means that agricultural commodities are often consumed in a different part of the world to where they are produced. And this means that the consumption of commodities in particular countries is linked to environmental and social impacts of those commodities in the countries where they're produced. And these links are made through global supply chains. And one of the key issues, which is telecoupled between production and consumption, is, sorry, I'm just having a problem with my screen share.
We can see your screen.
About this.
And everything.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry about that. So deforestation is one such environmental impact which is linked between consuming countries of commodities and production countries. So between 2002 and 2019, I think it says, around almost 400 million hectares of tree cover were lost globally. And of this, around 65 million hectares was primary tropical forest. And about a quarter of global forest loss in this period can be attributed to commodity production. And more than 90% of tropical forest loss between 2011 and 2015 was driven by agriculture. And we can say that about a quarter of tropical and subtropical deforestation was actually attributed to international demand for commodities. So deforestation is one such impact in producing countries, which is linked to the consumption of commodities in consuming countries. So sustainable supply chain initiatives have proliferated to address these telecoupled impacts. So some examples of sustainable supply chain initiatives are sectoral standards, certification schemes, and moratoria, some of which are familiar household names such as Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance. Also the Amazon soy moratorium would be an example of one of these. There have also been collective aspirations set by groups of both private sector and public sector stakeholders. These include the New York Declaration of Forests. The Consumer Goods Forum is also an organization of over 400 consumer goods companies that made a collective commitment to zero deforestation by 2020. And then finally, hundreds of individual companies around the world have made pledges to sustainability, whether that's zero deforestation or eliminating labor exploitation or child labor from their supply chains, and so on. And these sustainable supply chain initiatives, as we call them, are often linked to commodities, specifically related to deforestation. We often talk about beef, palm oil, soybeans, cocoa, and coffee. But despite the proliferation of these initiatives, which are supposed to improve the sustainability of global supply chains from both an environmental and social perspective, there is an emerging literature suggesting that there are equity challenges with these initiatives, and that also they are shaping and reshaping power asymmetries between the global north and global south. So from a practical point of view, some research by Janina Grabs, who is a member of our research group, published last year, argued that policies that are focused on conservation in supply chains can exclude non-compliant smallholder farmers, which exacerbates pre-existing vulnerabilities. But then thinking more about the way that these sustainable supply chain initiatives influence power, Janina and also Stefano Pont did research in the global coffee sector, which found that despite the proliferation of sustainable supply chain initiatives, the underlying power inequities in that sector have remained fundamentally unchanged for the last 40 years. In the cocoa sector, there has been literature published, including these two papers by Kraus and Barrientos, and also Victoria Maguire, Rachael and colleagues, but also other papers which have argued that corporate-led sustainability programs in the cocoa sector have shifted power to companies and entrenched historical hegemonies, while marginalizing smallholder voices, so therefore embedding power asymmetries. And there is similar research emerging in the palm oil sector from researchers such as Emmanuel Chains, Izabela Delabre, who we have speaking today, also myself. I have a paper in review, which indicates that specifically forest-focused supply chain initiatives in the oil palm sector privilege international experts, global knowledge, and market values over local people, knowledge, values, and politics. So that brings us together today to try and answer some questions about how and whether the sustainable supply chain initiatives can address unequal power relations and the underlying causes of unsustainable practices in telecoupled commodity production and consumption. So today we want to ask questions and answer questions such as, what claims do companies make about their policies and global supply chains? Who gets to determine what counts as knowledge and where? How do these policies reshape relations between the global north and global south through supply chains? And under what conditions might these policies and initiatives contribute to more sustainable and just globalized food production? So we have an expert panel, as I've mentioned, joining us, and we'd now like to have some introductions from each of our panelists and an overview of their research. And I'd like to just reiterate to our audience, please do ask lots of questions in the Zoom chat, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can in the next 50 minutes or so. So I'd like to start by handing over to Professor Rachael Garrett from the Conservation and Development Group here at Cambridge. So Rachael, please take it away with an introduction and overview of your research. I think you're on mute, Rachael.
Hi, so I'm a professor at Cambridge University and also ETH Zurich for the next year until I migrate completely to Cambridge. And so a number of people at ETH Zurich are here in this call that work with me as well as at Cambridge. And basically we collectively do research across Indonesia, oil palm, Ghana and Ivory Coast, cocoa, and Brazil, soy and beef cattle production systems. And we look at across all of these landscapes, the ways that company supply chain initiatives influence forest conservation and restoration efforts, but also how they're influencing market access and the livelihoods of farmers within these supply chains. And yeah, I'll leave it at that, I guess.
Thanks so much, Rachael. Izabela, if you'd like to give an introduction.
Cool. Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks so much for having me, and especially to Joss for doing such a great job organising this. So yeah, my name is Izabela Delabre. I am a lecturer at Birkbeck, the University of London, in environmental geography. So my interest really in this area is looking at the sort of local governance, local to global and global to local governance interactions in the space of the RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. I'm interested in that from a global political ecology lens. So how these globally constructed standards might be enacted in local spaces, and how those politics, local politics and power might shape those standards when they're implemented, and what that means for local communities and also deforestation. I've done a little bit of work in Peru and in Brazil a little bit as well. But mainly my research has looked at palm oil in Indonesia and Malaysia.
Great, thanks so much for that, Izabela. Christoph, over to you.
Thanks a lot for having me here today. My name is Christoph Obernack. I'm based at the Center for Development and Environment in Bern, Switzerland. I'm heading the research group on sustainability governance here at the center. We implement different projects in this research field. One is the Compass project, which investigates different strategies for more sustainable and inclusive value chains. Here we focus on cocoa and coffee sectors in Peru and Switzerland. And our key interest is here to compare different private governance strategies and business models, in particular certification schemes that you mentioned in the beginning, Joss, right? But also alternative strategies like inclusive businesses and also solidarity economy strategies. So inclusive business would refer to long-term business partnerships between buyers and producers, and solidarity economy would refer to governance structures that are based on co-ownership and democratic decision-making in organizing value chains. And here we compare those different strategies in terms of their governance instruments, their impacts on human well-being, and also the role of environmental justice. We see that all of them face some challenges and opportunities in this regard. Thanks.
Thanks so much for joining us, Christoph. And last but not least, Paulina.
Hello, yes, I'm Paulina von Hellerman. I'm at Goldsmith in the anthropology department at Goldsmiths University in London. And I have for the last 3 or in the end 4 years been doing had a major livelihood research fellowship where I was working on palm oil, but it was from the beginning and as a whole, it's been a very holistic project looking at everything right from the beginnings to current sort of manifestations. And it's turned increasingly more of a study, or the book I'm writing is more how to think through palm oil, to use palm oil to think through key questions in environmental anthropology, almost the other way around. So certification is very much in that, and of course in many ways at the heart of the kind of questions we all ask about global commodity production, but I'm not an expert on it at all, and certainly not in any way compared to everyone else here. But I just thought what the paper I ended up doing for this was just to kind of look at what we could possibly learn from looking at longer term perspectives. Yeah, I think I'll end on that.
Well, we're delighted to have you here, Pauline. I think your presentation is extremely interesting on the historical perspective on palm oil and what we can learn about palm oil sustainability efforts in supply chains from that. So I'll just round us off. I've introduced myself already, but just to give an overview of my research, over the last year, I've been conducting a global analysis comparing data on several commodity supply chains, namely cocoa, beef, soy, and palm oil. And my presentation for this session was focused on the cocoa sector, and we looked at the implementation of companies' initiatives underneath the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, which is an umbrella initiative, a multi-stakeholder initiative to reduce deforestation and improve farmer participation engagement in the cocoa sector in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And what we found through this research is that although the initiative, the umbrella initiative of the CFI provides a relatively similar structure for companies to design their policies, the implementation of these policies varies widely in between different companies because of the different sourcing needs they have, their different brand interests, and so on. And because there's very little coordination between companies, there is this plethora of individual projects with not much coordination between them, leading to limited impact. One thing that we do see, however, is that companies' implementation of their initiatives is quite closely linked to efforts to consolidate supply chains. So the risk that we've identified is that these forest-focused supply chain policies actually risk exacerbating existing power inequities in the cocoa value chain. So that's something we're looking into more. So thanks everyone for your introductions. And as I said, please do all, to all our audience members, please do post your questions in the Zoom chat. But I'd like to start by asking a question to Paulina and your historical perspective. So in your presentation, you mentioned that certification schemes such as the RSPO are embedded in and shaped by a corporate power and growth paradigm. And you say that questioning this approach might entail alternative conversations about no growth palm oil or peak palm oil, which are very interesting concepts that I've actually never encountered before. But what I wanted to ask you is that given that initiatives like the RSPO can function as international forums for dialogue on palm oil sustainability, Can these forums allow these alternative conversations to take place? And if not, what spaces remain? So, Pauline, it'd be great to hear from you on that question.
Thank you so much. I really should say from the outset that it was really just writing this presentation that I started thinking about this myself. So I wish I was like 10 months down the line from where I am now, but yes, I mean, I think it's a good question because, of course, these the RSPO and other sort of fora of this kind are so embedded in certain assumptions that it might be quite difficult to bring these other ideas in. But I think maybe really just starting with writing papers or just starting a language of discourses in possibly even social media, or I'm just sort of, I mean, maybe 1 or 2 papers on social media, and then maybe contributing and just sort of saying these things maybe in RSPO events, and just that might just trigger, I mean, it would probably trigger a lot of hostile reactions as well, but just to start the conversations. And so I should just briefly say, I don't know to what extent everyone has been able to watch all the presentations, but and I should also say that this idea actually came to me at the end of the presentation itself. So yeah, there were other elements of it, but it was just that I had the idea that you could really, all the degrowth and post-growth or peak oil sort of conversations could really be very much applied to the palm oil. It would be fruitful to think it through in the palm oil sector itself, and just to launch the ideas that maybe we have enough palm oil by now and we don't need to keep on growing, and that might in itself be a more fundamental kind of sustainability drive than trying to make well, the sort of criteria that are so difficult to actually sort of decide on and implement, especially. So I hadn't, it came at the end, and so I was thinking just maybe starting conversations, bringing it in informally, and possibly also just talking to people who you know in the sector. I remember 1 of 2 interviews Izabela and I did actually for another paper for Sam, yes, exactly, for your edited volume or your special issue, that 1 or 2, quite a few of them are themselves, they're not totally closed off to these conversations at all. So I think it's always worth having them. But the main thing I'd like to say is I just said it and I hadn't thought it through yet. So actually I would very much welcome any further conversation about this we might have today. I should probably stop there. That would, yeah. Thank you.
Well, no, thank you for that answer. I think that, yeah, it's an interesting agenda maybe to take forward conversations from a sort of alternative paradigm point of view. Izabela, did you have a point to respond on that?
Yeah, it was just to, yeah, totally agree with you, Paulina. I just, having sort of worked a bit in those spaces, and Joss is very familiar with those RSPO spaces as well. I just wonder how that sort of discussion goes down with so many powerful interests at play. That's not to say that it shouldn't be done, like those conversations need to happen, but I remember a few years back, it was David Suzuki up on stage talking and really I suppose opposing the palm oil industry and putting this all in a broader context of the fact that he had to pay I don't know, $5 for a little glass of mineral water in his hotel room, yet there was no tap water. I don't know, he was just sort of really spelling this out in front of this audience, and it was just seen as too extreme. I think it was too radical, even if the more radical thing is to continue as we are going. It was just kind of, yeah, that doesn't mean we don't stop pushing this or don't stop opening up that discussion. It was just interesting to see how in certain RSPO professionalized spaces these things get closed down in those sort of public RSPO spaces, yet one-to-one discussions such as, you know, those that we had with individuals in the sector, they're kind of aware of this broader ideological problem. It's just that pragmatism always comes across as as sort of the only way forward. Sorry to jump in there. I just yeah, just trying to imagine us trying to push this a little bit more in those spaces, and quite closed. I don't know what you think, Joss, from your experiences in the space as well.
Well, I'd just say, firstly, please don't apologise. I really want to encourage everyone in this discussion to make your contributions. And if you'd like to respond to anything anyone is saying, please just raise your hand. I'll try and make sure that you can respond. So on that note, before I say anything further, Victoria Maguire, Rachael, I think would like to make a contribution.
Yeah, so just on that point that Izabela raised about certain appetites, there's a trade-off with what can be deemed too radical, and yeah, one person's radical is another person's sanity. But I think it's important before launching a new debate and trying to get people to think about degrowth, think about one's audience. Same also with questions of colonialism, neo-colonialism, racialized capitalism. There are certain topics which just rub certain actors up the wrong way. It's not very productive to maybe engage a group of Swiss or Belgian cocoa traders on racialized capitalism and degrowth, when this is how the trade works, and this is how it's not, yeah, it's just very, I think it's good to think about who your audience is and what is actually going to lead to a productive conversation and a collaborative space. So that's all.
I think those are really excellent points. On what you've just said, Victoria, Rachael and I, and also Adelina, who I see is on this, has joined this session. We're at a meeting organised by Yanina, who's also here, in the summer, where we had a sort of roundtable workshop with academics and also some NGO participants, and also some actual traders, commodity traders. And just as you say, Victoria, some of the traders pointed out that they actually find it quite offensive when people use terms like colonialism to talk about the work that they're actually doing in their day-to-day jobs. So I think those are excellent points. But I was going to turn to Rachael next. Before I do, I actually just want to come back to Izabela, because your point actually touched on the question that I was going to ask you, which was just about awareness within the RSPO that you've encountered about these sorts of issues. So you've mentioned kind of one instance where a stakeholder stood up and made a statement, but you represented the Zoological Society of London on the RSPO board for a couple of years, and in your time, did you encounter any broader awareness of these issues beyond what you've already mentioned?
I mean, I suppose, I was thinking about, how the RSPO might mask the need for political reform, like broader political change. And I was just thinking about, like on the board, the way that the government would be seen, or governments would be seen as sort of inefficient or not able to make quick decisions in governance. And this this notion of urgency about making big, really quite big decisions quickly. Not that would always happen, but that was sort of certainly embedded in their sort of discourse. I think also, this idea that multi-stakeholderism is an end in itself, like the idea that collaboration is the answer rather than a means to an end, or part of some sort of wider political project. I think that would often be there, and I suppose the danger there is that that's just within the RSPO, but of course we're seeing that more broadly in food systems governance, this move from multi-stakeholderism away from multilateralism, like in the UN Global Food Systems Summit, and that sort of shift that the pragmatic participant needs to be included, and of course those interests need to be there, but this is always taking place in already defined boundaries of who should participate and how, and within what paradigm. And again, back to Paulina's point, it's always green growth. It's always that idea is possible, that endless green growth is the answer. and that's quite elusive in practice, isn't it?
I think that's an excellent point about multi-stakeholderism versus multilateralism. And on this point, I'd like to just bring Rachael in now, who examines some of the paradoxes in the discourses used by companies to advance their sustainable supply chain initiatives. The fact, Rachael, maybe you could say a little bit more about this more eloquently than I could, but one of the solutions that you propose to addressing those paradoxes, which are really intractable trade-offs between effectiveness and equity outcomes, is about involving broader sets of stakeholders through jurisdictional approaches. So I just wonder if you have any responses based on what Izabela's just said about that challenge of multi-stakeholderism, but also if you see any particular challenges for jurisdictional approaches based on the fact that there are some more powerful actors than others in certain jurisdictions.
Yes, well, first of all, I want to say that the work on paradoxes, Janina is here. She's the lead author on that work. But basically, I think that paper is super interesting because in writing up this paper which was on the company's own perceptions of their challenges, many of them really have elucidated, as well as the NGOs that Janina interviewed, many of them have really elucidated just how impossible it is to reconcile all these ambitious goals that companies have been setting in a context where there isn't necessarily a supportive international and producer region government context. And specifically in this case, it was referring to how there's a huge amount of civil society pressure to achieve zero deforestation in the supply chain, but also at the same time, there's this like add-on goal of smallholder inclusion, which is of course necessary for moral reasons, but also to ensure the effectiveness of conservation policies. But the thing is, and I think this speaks to a lot of the conversation we're having, is we can't expect supply chain actors to solve these problems. Like they can't solve the broader problem that is actually the system that enables them to exist in their current form. We can't actually ask them to change the system. And so this is where it's absolutely essential that importing countries and producing region countries are involved in developing solutions. And that's just why I think the only possible solution going forward that can overcome the many different challenges that occur with supply chain focused policies is to develop a landscape wide, and I focus on jurisdictions just because that's where there's a clear governance system. So at the state or municipal level, where you can leverage collaboration between different supply chain actors with the power of the state governor or the municipal leaders to develop a monitoring and enforcement system that takes into account equity at the onset, and does so by developing a clear pathway towards compliance for everyone, but also alternative opportunities for income generation, for food security, etc. So yeah, sorry, did you ask the second part of your question yet, or about equal power relations, or
exactly
saving that one for the next?
No, I think that's like you've given an excellent summary of what I was looking for. But what I also wanted to ask was actually just about a particular jurisdiction where you've worked, or a particular landscape, which is the Cerrado, where there are some very powerful stakeholders locally in the soy farmers, and what can be done to, when you have a jurisdictional approach or landscape scale approach, what can be done to manage those more powerful actors' interests?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I've seen empirical evidence on what can actually be done. I've been closely listening to Joyce Brandau, who's here, as she's been studying these things on the ground in Mato Grosso. And Joyce, feel free to jump in if you have any additional insights. But so while I've said that theoretically jurisdictional approaches offer us a way out of some of these intractable paradoxes, in reality, there's no evidence, at least from Joyce's initial insights, that they are reconciling those tensions, because it does seem like there's a lot of there hasn't been a huge real consideration of equity in the projects, and it does seem to be more of a scattershot of projects across the state and less of an integrated vision. Joyce, did you want to add anything? I don't want to put you on the spot, so you don't.
No, go ahead, Rachel. Actually,
Okay.
it's difficult for me today. I have the kids around, but go ahead. That's exactly what we have seen in Mato Grosso. There's not really comprehension and neither procedural equity to bring all together, neither companies. That's important to mention. Not just about people, but also about the companies for soy and cattle.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So Joyce found that there really wasn't, people were not taking very seriously the procedural equity aspects either, in terms of actually including people. So I don't have the answer for exactly how that could occur, but clearly there needs to be a clear governance architecture that builds on like indigenous community representation systems, which do exist in Brazil and are quite strong, but actually incorporates those into the efforts led by the governor's office, and which tend to be dominated more by agro-industrial interests. And in this case, the government of Mato Grosso has been run by soy farmers for a really long time.
Cool. Okay, thanks for that. I'd like to just change tack now for a moment to bring Christoph in. So Christoph has been doing really interesting work, as he mentioned, on inclusive business and solidarity economy strategies, which provide a kind of third possible solution to the jurisdictional approaches we've just mentioned. So Christoph, I wonder if you could just start off by just saying a little bit about precisely what your research is involved, just for the benefit of anyone who maybe hasn't watched your presentation yet.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I think how this topic can come in here in this discussion is that our research questions a bit more what is the business models and the private governance structures, the corporate governance structures behind supply chain policy. So the ones that you mentioned at the beginning, Joss, like certifications, collective aspirations, company pledges, but also the landscape approaches that you mentioned, Rachel, not just now. They are not explicit yet about what the business models of the companies or cooperatives are, right? And it makes a difference what we saw, whether we are speaking about cooperatives, family businesses, multinationals that are owned by a huge diversity of shareholders or by a few individual shareholders, if we are speaking about pharma co-owned enterprises and so on, right? So the business models and the corporate governance structures make a difference. And here in our study that we did now, there was an exploratory study. We saw that these businesses these business models and governance structures can make a difference by three main mechanisms. So by how value is created and is captured, right? So whether it's, for instance, through short value chain upgrading of producer positions, also maybe creating new value chains, right? This is all changing how value is created. Second mechanism could be the distribution of value between different actors within the value chains, right? Here we speak about prices in the end, but also about the beneficial ownership in value chain operations, right? It makes a difference who's able to appropriate the value that is created, but also how non-monetary values are recognized, right? Not only about prices. And thirdly, speaking about solidarity economy, for instance, could imply thinking about co-ownership structures. And there are some interesting examples of companies in which producers who live in a country of the global south co-own now companies that are registered in the global north, right? And this makes a difference in terms of not only beneficial ownership, but also in terms of voice and distribution, decision-making power in corporate decision-making. And so here, I think, inclusive business models and also solidarity economy initiatives can make a difference with regard to global commodity chains.
Thanks so much for that overview, Christoph. And I'd just like to say to all of our audience members, please do write any questions you might have in the chat box. Christoph, just to follow up on that, I just wanted to ask, I think you had 4 case studies that you looked at in your presentation. I was just wondering if you know what were the sort of antecedent conditions that led to the creation of those specific either solidarity economy tactics or inclusive businesses in each of those 4 conditions that might be replicated.
Yeah, indeed. Essentially, we saw 2. Well, this was really 4 extreme cases, right? There are many more. We saw that there can be an inclusive business pathway to make value chains more inclusive, and there can be a solidarity economy pathway, right? It depends a bit on whether where's the drive for more inclusive value chains coming from? Is it coming from a collaboration, a contractual long-term partnership between a buyer and a producer group, right? A cocoa producer group in our case. That's more the inclusive business pathway. And then solidarity economy is very much driven by communities, be it for instance through producer cooperatives, very classical, or be it through co-owned companies, right? And interestingly, we saw similar conditions for making them more successful, and there are also limitations, but the conditions for making those enterprises or cooperatives more successful included several aspects, right? One set of conditions refers to the capital, to make investments. Sometimes this is, indeed, this is capital intensive, right? And here we saw that all of those cases needed some mission-driven investments, right? Be it through mission-driven co-investors or also investors who are patient in a sense, right? Not asking for quick financial return. Or project funding through governmental support schemes have been also another source of dealing with the huge investment needs that are required here. We also saw a second set of conditions. These are social relations between persons on both sides of the Atlantic, right? We compared Peruvian and Swiss enterprises and co-ops. And here, in all of our cases, it's not just a business relation, it's also a social relation, up to friendship sometimes, right? And at least a long-term and trustful relation has been always the foundation to make those successful. And here, maybe things like joint projects or fairs or visits can help. Third set of conditions is the know-how, how to build also new value chains, also to have the entrepreneurial spirit to develop such a new thing, right? It's been a third condition. And finally, and this may be already speaking to some limitations, all of those cases are targeting premium markets, right? So where consumers have high willingness to pay, high ability to pay for good quality chocolates, right? This was a deliberate choice of those entrepreneurs to build those value chains. And yeah, it works, right? If you have for instance, Swiss consumer who is able to pay $5 for a chocolate bar, this can work, right? And then you have more to distribute. And this could also already speak to some limitations. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it here.
Well, thanks so much for that. And the case of premiums, I think, is a really interesting one. We have a question from Yanina. Yanina, I don't know if you'd like to ask that question directly, or I can just do it on your behalf, but I'll give you a second to ask.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I have a lot of background noise here, but my question was whether this phenomenon of producer co-ownership is something that is growing or that is going beyond single cases. So I know there's just very prominent examples, but I wonder whether it's actually something that other companies are taking inspiration from, in your opinion, Christoph.
Thanks, Janina. I think the very classical example of co-ownership it's cooperatives, right? In the sense of memberships, right? So in that sense, this is not something particularly new. I think the new thing that is arising is if these co-ownership structures exist across distance, right? Where in our case, Peruvian cocoa farmers are shareholders of a Swiss company, or similar cases exist between Ecuador and Germany, for instance, right? But these are really niche cases at the moment. These co-ownership models are, I guess, at the moment niches, but they are growing. I think there's also a Ghanaian and German example, but you can still count them kind of, right?
Great, and we also have a question from Paulina to open that this discussion up to some of the other commodity expertise that's covered in our panel. So Izabela, obviously you've done a lot of work in palm. Rachael, you've done a lot of work on soy and also beef. But sorry to put you on the spot, but do you either of you have any views on how these other commodities might then lend themselves more or less to the sorts of pathways and business models that Christoph has mapped out? Rachael, please go ahead. You're muted still.
Sorry, I'm not used to wearing headphones, but my office is pretty loud. So we were actually discussing this on a call the other day, Janina and Joss and some other people were there. We were talking about limits to what can be done in cocoa, and I was reflecting on how it's so different in beef and soy in Brazil, but especially for soy, because you don't have this smallholders. You don't have smallholders as a huge component of the supply chain. In soy, it's not possible. You have to have capital. So if we're talking about smallholders, it's not just according to size, but capital endowments. And then in beef, there's also quite a lot of wealthier, large ranchers. But these are not traders, right? These are farmers still who have money. And in those cases, like you can see that it's not necessarily supply chains in general that force farmers into a situation where they get none of the profit margin. It's the situation of those supply chains in particular contexts. And soybean farmers who are able to come into a supply chain that has even lower profit margins, but take out a bigger chunk of the margin because they have much more power. And I mean, they have their own options in terms of trading, and they've taken the power of trading into their own hands, or at least at the level of cooperatives, where they say, if you're not going to give us the good price, then we're just going to we're not going to make a futures contract with you, or we're not going to a forward contract with you, or we're going to store it. And of course, the storage is a real material issue that's not possible in every case, but they're only able to store it because they also build up drying infrastructure and storage infrastructure. So, I mean, you can see different models across different supply chains based on how wealthy the farmers are. And the same for beef cattle, where the wealthier beef cattle ranchers were able to respond to these commitments, at least as an example from Para, by taking advantage of it and now selling their beef for a better carcass weight for a better price, because they were able to meet the company's commitments. And so, yeah, just to say that there are models that exist, but in a different context.
Izabela, I don't know if you have any thoughts from a palm oil perspective.
Yeah, it's not an area of work I've looked into very much, so I don't know how usefully you could comment. But my friend has just released a paper, so I'll find the link and add it to the chat here. That might be helpful, because that was around sort of how these different different business models make it you have better outcomes. But more of a comparison. So I'll share that when I find it.
Well, thanks so much for that in advance. Also, Izabela, though, you're, sorry, we might have another question here. Omar, Omar, I don't know if you want to just
Mate, I'll just go for it. It'll probably be easier than you trying to make sense of that. But just first, I think a comment. It was really nice, kind of hearing Christoph's insights about the solidarity economy and how that kind of really nicely links with kind of ideas of peak palm and kind of degrowth, and the idea of cooperatives is kind of quite central in degrowth economies, and thinking about we inevitably live in a telecoupled and globalized world, and if we want to continue kind of operating in this way, if a transformative context was to be possible, how could we have small and equitable supply chains? So I was just kind of maybe this would be a question for you, Joss, based on your time in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and just thinking about what conditions did you feel, I know you talked about it in your talk a bit, but maybe just elaborate on that, facilitated kind of small scale and equitable kind of possibilities, just like direct relationships, or was it maybe based on kind of decentralized governance, local governance coming in? That might be something quite interesting to think about a bit. So yeah, maybe I'll just stop there and add that maybe it's also just based on needing to deconstruct some ideas. I think in political ecology, this is kind of the second part of what political ecologists often do, and that is about trying to go back historically to try and understand how these narratives come about. So I think Tanya Lee has written a lot about palm oil in the Indonesian context, and talked about how often it's really hard to kind of deconstruct the idea that it's corporate-based kind of plantations that are what distribute rural development best. So maybe that kind of counter-narrative work is also kind of necessary, and maybe just interesting to hear your insights about the West African context there. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for that question, Omar. I think really interestingly, if you compare Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, in Cote d'Ivoire, there are actually much more developed cooperatives and a more developed cooperative structure, despite the fact that one of the complaints that participants in our research made was that actually decentralization of governance was very poor in Cote d'Ivoire, and comparatively decentralized governance is more developed in Ghana, where there are more community-based resource management structures and so on. So it's not, I think, necessarily the case that decentralized governance when it comes to sustainability is necessarily what provides the conditions for cooperative development, but maybe it's also to do with the specific structures around which support cooperative development, or a culture of cooperative work amongst farmers. Just on your question about which I kind of interpret as being about the dominant discourse around the need for large-scale agricultural investments to provide rural development. I think that's an incredibly interesting question, because that would be the predominant discourse in the government in Liberia, where I did my PhD research. And the focus of the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf government there was to bring in large-scale investment in order to develop the rural economy, basically through large-scale oil palm plantations. And that appears not to work. And I also think that it links nicely to Christoph's work, because I understand that, Christoph, your interest in solidarity economies and inclusive business also came from having studied large-scale land acquisitions and large-scale agricultural investments, and found these don't provide the development that governments maybe think they will. So maybe I can bounce the question forward to Christoph to ask about how you, if you could elaborate on how you came to study inclusive business and solidarity economies.
Yeah, thanks. If I could still, well, I think the base, to answer your last question, Joss, I think these are just important considerations in rethinking the business models and governance structures within corporations. That's the reason why we do this. And I wanted to also comment on what Omar has been saying about solidarity economy. Well, to put it bluntly, also a cooperative can be very much growth oriented, right? Even though having maybe an internal solidarity economy model, but if the people who are occupying or populating that cooperative would like to grow as much as they want, as they can, right? So it can still be very consistent with a growth logic. And I guess here it's for me, it's a combination of the organizations that are active in a value chain or in a landscape on the one hand, but also the systemic pressures and logics in which they are embedded, right? If there's pressure to grow, for instance, because otherwise you could not repay your debt, then maybe there's a need for also cooperatives to grow and to embark on businesses that are really endless growth oriented. But it's also about human agency, right? The wishes and needs and values and visions that that the persons who are indeed, yeah, the entrepreneurs who are designing those organizations and value chains, this makes a difference, right? And I think for me, the question of is solidarity economy and endless growth compatible or incompatible depends on, in the end, on those systemic pressures, the organizational structures that are created, and then the humans that are actually populating it. So I would not equate the solidarity economy with post-growth or degrowth per se. Of course, it can be, but there are also cooperatives that are huge and for that reason and grow continuously.
Thanks, Christoph. We have a question from Janina. I don't know if Janina, you'd like to go ahead and ask that one. And then I think we have a few minutes left. So yeah, any more questions, please post them now. Janina, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, unless anybody else has a question, but I was wondering, because we were talking about the cocoa versus soy example, and a lot of times also in coffee, you hear this idea that basically the 1 to 2 hectare smallholder model is just unsustainable in and of itself, and that you need to have a certain farm size in order to be able to actually have a profitable long-term business strategy. And I wanted to, maybe this is a provocative question, but ask whether there's a need in these sectors of some farm consolidation in order to actually change some of these patterns that keep reoccurring, whichever type of band-aid solution we try to put into it. And we'd love to hear the opinion of the panelists.
Would anyone like to take that question? I've got I have some thoughts on it, but if would anyone else like to jump in? Rachel or Izabela? Maybe we go Rachel and then Izabela.
Sure, just quickly, I mean, yeah, what Owen said in the chat, that there's same dialogues around other sustainability issues and supply chains. But I mean, the scale of farming systems has a lot to do with the context again, and I don't think that farm consolidation necessarily makes sense in certain contexts, and especially not where they're in places where there's no mechanization requirement. The scale issue is a lot less relevant because scaling is just, it's really critical with mechanization. But I think what's more important is the culture of cooperation, which somebody mentioned earlier. But in Brazil, like, you just see amazing coffee cooperative structures, and just in general, there's a huge culture of cooperation. I mean, farmers there are so organized. And in coffee, they are very professionalized and have taken to marketing products directly. So yeah, I think that there's no magic number, and that it's more about organizing cooperatives in line with the sort of physical attributes of the system, the size of the farm, their distance to markets, etc.
Izabela, go ahead.
No, I wanted you to comment. I wanted to hear what you have to say.
I was just going to reflect on the cocoa situation, where I think also there are a lot of cultural ties to cocoa production, emotional reasons people are involved in cocoa production and want to stay in cocoa production, and also then there are issues with land tenure associated with the potential to consolidate farms, or actually, as happens a lot in cocoa, to continually divide farms between generations. So those factors also have to be taken into consideration. I think Owen has left, and Rachel's mentioned his comment already. I'm aware that we're coming up to the end of our hour. The line is going to stay open until 4:15. when Omar and Cyan will be doing a wrap-up session for the workshop. So anyone who wants to stay on and continue the discussion for the next 18 or 17 minutes is more than welcome to do so. I actually just wanted to loop the conversation back again to Paulina and Izabela when it comes to discourses. So I think we started the conversation talking about specific discourses within the palm oil sector and how those constrain the potential for sustainability and the inclusion of marginalised stakeholders. And then we've come on to talk about all potential solutions to improving sustainability, which included landscape and jurisdictional approaches, and also alternative economic strategies, which Christoph has mentioned. Now we've had a long discussion about. But how compatible, I want to ask Paulina and Izabela, how compatible do you think these alternative strategies actually are with more of an emancipatory discourse and moving away from the constraints that are imposed by this market-based ideology in which sustainable supply chain initiatives have really developed? I don't know who wants to maybe tackle that first. Perhaps Paulina, or yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy. I have to go quite soon as well, just because I now have another meeting, unfortunately. But otherwise, I would love to continue this. I feel actually just want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this, because it's your whole project and all the different papers sound so interesting, and there's so much to learn. I feel it's actually a lot more here than we can talk about in 1 hour. But yeah, just to say, Victoria, I really appreciated your point. You're completely right about different audiences, and that you have to be targeted, obviously. And I was trying to think in what case, what terminology works best where. It's actually in general very useful, but maybe in particular in this area. But in terms of how it, yeah, I mean, I see it's actually, sorry, I simply haven't, I could have a go at, but I haven't thought it through very much. But I think both landscape and jurisdictional approaches are really interesting and good in themselves. So it's, I haven't actually, to be honest, one thing I simply haven't done, but you probably have done it, or others here, whether how much growth is embedded, or how growth is actually, what kind of future projections are in them. I suppose that's also one way of thinking about it. I don't know, but it might be quite useful to just look at that in itself, like what the assumptions are, and also more concrete, concrete future anticipations. I yet again, I feel, Izabela, I will hand over to you, because I know less.
No, yeah, I'm interested in how those. Sorry, I see Rachel's got your hands up. Rachel, I'm interested in the landscape and jurisdictional approaches, because I feel like, especially in the RSPO participation days, everyone was sort of pointing to those to be the answer, but we weren't seeing the concrete results of those. But I was also interested in how, in these sort of more regional, local spaces, is there not a possibility that we would see those power imbalances reflected again? And are there opportunities to, I don't know, redress power in those delegated spaces of governance? So, I mean, I'm thinking about like the, there's the PCI initiative in Mato Grosso, right? So in those spaces still, as you say, like there's powerful players taking up a lot of the space in those discussions. How can, what opportunities are there for redressing power there?
Yeah, that was definitely not the question I was going to answer, because I don't know how you can redress the power, but what I was going to say was that in that particular circumstance, there's a distinction about growth. So I think the biggest challenge is that there's a broader, Sam Levy, a former PhD student in my group, had a chapter in his dissertation about this the Cerrado being a sacrifice frontier. So combining the sacrifice zone with the frontier concepts, to say that the whole soy narrative in the Cerrado is not just about growth, but is about growth at the expense of the Cerrado forest, and then we have to sacrifice the Cerrado vegetation to for this growth, for this food security, for the economy, etc. In that the Amazon is the one that can be protected. And so I personally am much more interested in decoupling the growth itself from the deforestation than trying to tackle additionally, although I totally get what all of you are saying, then additionally tackle the issue of growth, because I feel that it's completely unnecessary for them to be connecting the growth to the need for deforestation, because there is already a huge amount of area that's cleared. So I guess I'm conscious of putting my effort into working within their narratives to a certain degree, to have them focusing their growth on intensification on existing cleared areas, because there actually are some win-wins still possible in the intensification space there, just because the yield gaps are so big, especially in pasture and in oil palm, but especially in pasture. And so you can expand soy onto it, you can improve cattle ranching, you can do all of that and never clear another forest. But instead, this political backlash has led to a very clear sacrifice narrative. So anyway, just going to add that.
I'd be really interested to know how that narrative varies and how the potential to kind of decouple the deforestation discourse from the growth discourse varies according to the country context. And I'm thinking about highly forested countries where I've worked before, some of which have areas which could be developed and actually maybe don't need the sort of development that their governments say they do, arguably. But in those countries, I imagine there's maybe it might even be more difficult or more necessary to tie in the deforestation discourse to the growth discourse. But that would be, I think, a really interesting thing to look at. Izabela.
I feel like something that's coming up again and again is, this idea of, context and variation, or yet like at odds with standardization and this whole idea of standards. And I wonder if we can sort of go back to the idea of standards and what they sort of say about, how we need compliance and how they're enacted in different places in different ways. And yeah, I suppose I'm coming at this from the plantations working group lens, where we're looking at sort of plantations as a logic of organising society beyond the boundaries of the plantation. And of course, if anyone, so this is a group that's convened, and I think a couple of you are members, so if anyone else is interested in joining, be very happy to have you as part of that. But I'm wondering if the idea of the standards and certification is an extension of that plantation logic, because it's saying that you can apply these standardized or simplified or calculable logics or measurements in other places. Sorry, that's really messy. It's just like an idea that I'm grappling with at the moment. That, yeah, I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts.
I get your point, but I think that the Brazilian pasture context is so different, because it actually the pasture itself and the political ecology of pasture expansion is already based in a modernization paradigm, where they were trying to get rid of the messy backwardness of the Amazon forest and replace it with these pastures. So then the question is putting in like a integrated crop livestock system a sort of a worsening of that type of logic, or is it actually an improvement? Because it brings together, I think, actually a much more intense managerial role, much more professionalized than like diversified system compared to the existing production system. It's a little bit less also violent against nature, because pasture ranching, pastures actually have one of the lowest biodiversity, species richness, and also the soil structure, and you know what I mean? So it's like, it's actually adding a lot more complexity and diversity and choice into the system. compared to, I think, trying to take like an agroforestry, low density. If we're talking about cocoa agroforestry and oil palm agroforestry, I think if you're talking about closing those yield gaps by doing a monoculture with high inputs is a very different question. You know, those are two different sustainable intensification paradigms.
Thank you, Rachel. That's really interesting.
Christoph, just come back to you. I'm not sure if you were able to look, or if you were able to look at any environmental outcomes yet. I think your colleague Trent Blair might have looked at some environmental outcomes from these alternative business models. But I just wonder if you have any findings, or if there's any plans to look at those.
Well, we didn't, in our current study, we did not yet include systematic measurement of environmental outcomes. What we observe, though, is it really depends on the mission and the value proposition of an enterprise, right? And there are some interesting examples of private enterprises that are making claims of protecting biodiversity, or actually being climate positive, or actually having surplus beneficial effects for biodiversity based on their sourcing practices of cocoa, in our case. And this is written in the business model itself, right? The raison d'être of that enterprise, and the way that enterprise is making is trying to be economically viable, right? And this is then a pathway in which I see there is a potential for positive biodiversity outcomes, right? The second question is also who's really sitting on the board of an enterprise, right? And if there are people who are having an idea of reconciling economic and environmental, well, economic activity and environmental sustainability, right? This makes difference to entrepreneurs, whoever they are, right? That really focus on making an income out of what they are doing, right? And it does not matter if that's a buyer from Europe, or if that is a cocoa farmer from South America, right? All of them can be entrepreneurs and very much driven by economic income incentives, right? Or through other values, right? So that's really, so again, the interplay of people and organizations.
Cool. Thanks so much for that, Christoph. I think Paulina has already dropped off, and Rachel is about to drop off as well. So I just want to take the opportunity to say thanks so much to everybody. We have another question for Victoria I'm happy to take if people want to stay on, but Rachel, thanks so much. And Victoria, if you want to follow up on Christoph's point.
Yeah, I think just it's an important question that you ask to examine the environmental impact and the efficacy, if that's the term you want to use, of these inclusive business models. Certainly within certification, which maybe doesn't fall under your definition, Christoph, of an inclusive business model, but in some research that I did in Brazil with smallholder coffee cooperatives. So we had the data of all the Rainforest Alliance group certification across, I think, 12 years. And we did find that there were both social sustainability positive outcomes and environmental sustainability positive outcomes. But then equally, there's been a lot of literature stating otherwise, that smallholders can't find the exigencies and the compliance of certification too difficult, or there are too many barriers, and because they find it so difficult to comply, there is negligible or even negative environmental outcomes. So yeah, there's evidence on both ways, and I think it's important whenever any new or alternative model is proposed, like the more evidence there is on its efficacy and equity, it's important to get that out there and have as much data-driven results behind that. So good point to bring that up, Joss.
Great, thanks, Victoria. So we have our last couple of minutes. Christoph, do you want to come back on that? I saw you hit your
Yeah,
mute
if I
button.
may briefly respond to what you said. Really interesting point. What we saw in our research now is those 4 cases that were underpinning my presentation here. They all used organic certification, right, to verify environmental compliance. But we also met many others in Peru, where we do our research, and in Switzerland, who are not using certification schemes, but for instance, direct relations to and trust-based, right? So this is maybe less traceable from a consumer perspective, but still maybe more efficient for, in particular, the small scale producers who may not be able to afford the increased certification costs, but also production costs that might be associated with certain environmental practices. So I guess there can be different paths to environmental sustainability depending on size as well of producers.
Size and barriers and access to markets and length of supply chains. There are so many variables. So yeah, like what happens in Peru versus soy in Brazil, or there are a lot of variables, but it's good to get some results, get some data, and to hear from other people pursuing these transformative pathways.
Cool. All right. Thanks so much, guys, for the really fantastic inputs. I think we're down to our last few people, and Omar's session's about to kick off, I know. So I think I might draw things to a close there. I don't know if anyone has any final thoughts, but just want to say thanks again so much for joining. Thanks to everyone for all the questions. And the excellent presentations. I'm hoping, Omar, I don't know if you could confirm this, but I'm hoping the presentations will stay up. I think the 5 presentations together are really interesting and a diverse look at the various issues with sustainable supply chain initiatives.
And very complementary.
Yeah,
I go to so many
should do.
workshops where they don't speak to each other. So this was excellent. And the way you brought it together, Joss, well done. I should have said that in front of everyone.